Sometimes the loneliest people don't realize they're lonely until one unexpected person makes them stop walking. Rain slid down the glass towers of Midtown Manhattan like silver tears from the sky, blurring the city into streaks of gold and charcoal beneath the storm. 43 floors above the streets, inside one of the most expensive restaurants in New York City, Ethan Calloway adjusted the cuff of his black suit and stared at the diamond ring hidden inside his coat pocket. It felt heavier than it should have, almost cold. The rooftop restaurant glowed with soft amber light, and quiet piano music drifting through the air like smoke. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above wealthy couples sipping champagne that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. Everything smelled of polished marble, expensive perfume, and rain-soaked leather coats. It was the kind of place where people laughed softly because real problems never reached this high above the city. Ethan hated it instantly, not because it wasn't beautiful, but because it reminded him too much of himself. Perfect, expensive, empty. At 38 years old, Ethan was one of the youngest CEOs in America. Tech magazines called him a visionary. Wall Street called him ruthless. Employees lowered their voices when he walked through the halls of Callaway Dynamics, the billion-dollar company he had built into an empire after his father died. He owned penthouses in 3 cities, flew private when he wanted silence, and had enough money to disappear from the world forever if he chose to. But none of it had stopped the quiet waiting for him every night when he came home. His best friend Daniel used to joke that Ethan lived like a ghost inside a museum. Tonight's blind date had been Daniel's idea. One dinner, he had insisted. Just try being human again. Ethan almost laughed thinking about it now. Human. The word sounded foreign. He stepped toward the private dining room where the woman was already waiting for him. Somewhere nearby, glasses clinked softly. A waiter hurried past carrying lobster risotto beneath warm silver lids. Then Ethan heard it. A sound so small most people would have missed it. Entirely. A muffled cry behind a service hallway door. Ethan stopped walking. The piano music continued. Rain tapped gently against the windows overlooking Central Park. Another soft sob slipped through the crack of the half-closed employee door. He should have ignored it. Men like Ethan did not stop for things like this. But something in the sound felt painfully real in a world where everything else was rehearsed. Slowly, he moved closer. Through the narrow opening, he saw her. A young waitress standing alone beside a row of metal lockers under harsh fluorescent lights. She pressed trembling fingers against her mouth, trying desperately not to let anyone hear her cry. Her uniform was simple black and white, slightly worn at the sleeves. Her blonde hair had come loose from its knot, falling softly around a face pale with exhaustion. In one hand, she held a crumpled hospital bill. In the other, an old flip phone pressed against her ear. "Please," she whispered shakily. "Just give me until Friday. I'm trying." Ethan felt something strange tighten inside his chest. Not pity. Something worse. Recognition. Because for the first time in years, he was looking at someone who wasn't pretending. The girl lowered the phone slowly, as if even moving too fast might cause her entire world to collapse. For a moment, she simply stood there beneath the cold fluorescent lights, staring at the hospital bill in her shaking hands, while rain rattled softly against the narrow service hallway window behind her. Ethan remained still outside the door, hidden by the shadows and the quiet luxury of a world that had never taught him what to do with another person's pain. Then the restaurant manager's sharp voice sliced through the hallway. "Clara, where are you? Table 12 is waiting." The young woman inhaled quickly and wiped beneath her eyes before anyone could see the tears. It was not vanity. It was survival. Ethan stepped back instinctively just before she pushed open the door. She nearly collided with him. Her blue eyes widened with alarm for half a second before embarrassment rushed into her face. "I am sorry, sir," she said immediately, lowering her gaze. "I did not mean to keep guests waiting." Her voice was soft, but not weak. Ethan noticed that first. Most people around wealth either became overly confident or painfully small. Clara Bennett did neither. She simply looked tired. Deeply tired. Up close, Ethan could see details the dim hallway had hidden. Her makeup had faded after a long shift. A tiny loose thread hung from the cuff of her uniform sleeve. Her white sneakers were clean but worn thin at the soles. She could not have been older than 24. Yet her eyes carried the heaviness of someone who had spent years pretending everything was fine. Ethan should have walked away. Instead, He found himself asking quietly, "Are you okay?" Clara blinked as if the question itself surprised her. People in places like this rarely asked waitresses if they were okay. They asked for more ice, more wine, faster service. "Yes, sir," she answered automatically. Then, after a tiny pause, she added with a faint apologetic smile, "Just a long night." Somewhere beyond the hallway, laughter erupted from the dining room. Rich men discussing markets. Women wrapped in silk dresses leaning against marble bars. The warm glow of chandeliers spilled into the service corridor like sunlight reaching a basement. Clara straightened her shoulders immediately, slipping the folded hospital bill into her apron pocket before anyone else could notice it. Ethan saw the motion. He also noticed her phone wallpaper for the briefest second before the screen went dark. A little boy smiling from a hospital bed while holding a stuffed dinosaur almost bigger than himself. Something inside Ethan shifted quietly. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just enough to make him realize he no longer cared about the blind date waiting upstairs. "Clara." The manager barked again from around the corner. "Move." She nodded quickly and stepped past Ethan toward the dining room, carrying herself with practiced calm despite the storm still trembling behind her eyes. Ethan watched her disappear into the sea of gold light and expensive conversation. Then he reached into his pocket and touched the velvet ring box again. It suddenly felt absurd, heavy in all the wrong ways. His phone buzzed, with a text from Daniel. "She is already there. Do not run away this time." Ethan stared at the message for several silent seconds before slipping the phone back into his coat. Across the restaurant, Clara carefully balanced a tray of champagne glasses while a wealthy couple ignored her existence completely. But Ethan noticed her, and for reasons he could not explain yet, he could not stop. The private dining room overlooked the Manhattan skyline like the bridge of a luxury ship floating above a storm. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city in silver rain and glowing headlights far below, while soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers in the ceiling. At the center table sat Vanessa Whitmore, the woman Daniel had insisted was perfect for Ethan. She certainly looked perfect. Her dark emerald dress shimmered beneath the candlelight. Diamond earrings caught every movement of her carefully styled hair. Even her smile looked expensive. "You are late," Vanessa said lightly as Ethan entered the room. Her tone was playful, but practiced. Everything about her felt practiced. Ethan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slowly. "Traffic," he answered, though both of them knew men like Ethan never truly sat in traffic. Vanessa laughed softly and lifted her wine glass. "Daniel warned me you hated blind dates." Ethan gave a faint smile out of politeness, but his attention drifted almost immediately toward the restaurant floor outside the glass walls. Clara moved carefully between crowded tables, carrying trays balanced expertly in one hand. Her expression remained calm despite the exhaustion pressing against her shoulders. Ethan noticed how she always smiled before approaching guests, even when they barely looked at her. It was the kind of smile people learned only after life disappointed them early. Vanessa continued speaking, unaware she was slowly losing him. "My father says your company might buy 3 smaller firms before Christmas. Is that true?" Ethan looked back at her. "Possibly." "Smart," she said approvingly. "The market is weak right now. It is the perfect time to swallow competitors." Ethan nodded quietly, though the words left a strange bitterness in his mouth. Outside the room, Clara stopped beside an elderly couple seated near the piano. The old woman dropped her fork accidentally onto the floor. Before the embarrassed husband could react, Clara knelt immediately and replaced the utensil with a warm smile that softened the woman's obvious discomfort. "Do not worry about it," Clara said gently. "Happens to my grandfather every Thanksgiving." The elderly woman laughed with relief. Ethan found himself watching the exchange longer than he should have. "So," Vanessa said, drawing his attention back again, "what exactly are you looking for in someone?" Ethan almost answered automatically. "Intelligent, elegant, sophisticated." The same meaningless list people like him always repeated. But before he could speak, movement near the center dining room suddenly interrupted the calm atmosphere. A young server carrying champagne collided lightly with Clara as they crossed paths near table 16. One crystal flute tipped sideways, splashing pale gold liquid across the front of a wealthy woman's designer coat. Silence spread instantly across the nearby tables. The woman stared down at the stain in horror. Then her face hardened. Are you serious? She snapped sharply. Clara froze. I am so sorry, ma'am. Do you know how much this coat costs? The woman stood abruptly, drawing attention from half the restaurant now. People like you need to learn how to be careful. Clara lowered her eyes politely. Yes, ma'am. I apologize. Ethan watched closely, not because of the mistake. Mistakes happened every second in New York City. No, what captured him was the way Clara handled humiliation without losing herself. She did not argue. She did not beg. She simply stood there absorbing the cruelty with quiet dignity while expensive strangers stared at her like part of the entertainment. Vanessa glanced toward the scene briefly before taking another sip of wine. Honestly, she muttered dismissively, restaurants should stop hiring people who clearly cannot handle pressure. Ethan looked at her slowly. Then he looked back at Clara standing alone beneath the chandelier light while rain hammered softly against the windows behind her. For reasons he could not fully explain yet, the most beautiful person in the room was no longer sitting across from him. The silence around table 16 lingered for several uncomfortable seconds before conversations slowly resumed beneath the glow of chandeliers and the low hum of jazz music. Clara moved carefully to clean the spilled champagne, while the wealthy woman continued muttering under her breath about incompetence and ruined fabric. Ethan could see other guests watching with detached amusement, the same way people watched rain hit windows during dinner. Temporary, harmless, easy to ignore. Clara finished wiping the tablecloth with steady hands despite the faint redness rising in her cheeks. Again, I sincerely apologize, ma'am, she said softly. The woman scoffed and waved her away dismissively, as though Clara were no more important than the empty wineglass beside her plate. Ethan felt something unfamiliar twist sharply beneath his ribs. Not anger exactly. Shame. Shame at how normal this all seemed to everyone else. Vanessa leaned back in her chair and sighed lightly. You are staring, she said with a teasing smile. Ethan looked at her absently. Am I? At the waitress. She lifted one perfectly shaped eyebrow. Do not tell me you are developing a hero complex tonight. Ethan glanced toward Clara again. She had already moved on to another table, carrying herself with the same quiet professionalism as if the humiliation had never happened. No, he answered quietly. I think I am just noticing things. Vanessa laughed softly, misunderstanding him entirely. That sounds dangerous. A waiter arrived carrying their entrees on polished silver trays. Filet mignon for Vanessa. Sea bass for Ethan. The plates looked like artwork beneath the candlelight. Vanessa immediately reached for her phone to photograph the meal before touching it. Across the restaurant, Clara discreetly checked her own phone near the service station. Ethan saw the brightness from the screen illuminate her face for a brief moment before all color drained from it. Her shoulders stiffened instantly. Fear. Real fear. She typed something quickly, then slipped the phone back into her apron. While forcing herself to continue working, Ethan barely touched his food after that. Every instinct told him to mind his own business. His entire life had been built on emotional distance. Distance made decisions easier. Distance kept people manageable. But tonight, every time he looked toward Clara, that distance seemed to shrink without permission. Then the lights went out. The entire restaurant fell into darkness so suddenly that several guests gasped aloud. Somewhere near the kitchen, glass shattered against the floor. Emergency backup lights flickered on seconds later, bathing the restaurant in a dim red glow that transformed the elegant dining room into something strangely intimate and uncertain. Rain pounded harder against the windows now. Thunder rolled above the city. A nervous murmur spread through the guests. Then came the sound. A child crying. Sharp. Panicked. Near the center tables, a little boy around 7 years old clung desperately to his mother while the sudden darkness overwhelmed him. It is okay, the mother whispered frantically, clearly embarrassed as nearby diners stared. But the child only cried harder, covering his ears as the storm outside rattled the glass walls. People shifted awkwardly, some annoyed, some uncomfortable. No one moved. Then Clara crossed the room quietly. Ethan watched as she knelt beside the terrified little boy without hesitation. Hey, she said gently, her voice softer than the music itself. Can I tell you a secret? The boy looked at her through tears. Clara glanced upward dramatically toward the dark chandeliers. When I was little, thunderstorms scared me too. So my brother told me something. The child sniffled. What? Clara smiled faintly. He said thunder only sounds loud because clouds are terrible at whispering. A few nearby guests chuckled softly, but Clara kept her attention entirely on the little boy. Then, beneath the dim red emergency lights and the distant sound of rain, she began humming quietly. A simple lullaby. Gentle, warm, human. Slowly, impossibly, the child calmed down. Ethan stared at her from across the restaurant while the storm shook Manhattan outside. And for the first time in years, the silence inside his chest did not feel empty anymore. The emergency lights continued glowing softly above the restaurant like fading embers while outside the storm swallowed Manhattan in sheets of silver rain. Guests slowly returned to their conversations after the frightened little boy finally relaxed in his mother's arms. But something inside the atmosphere had shifted. The restaurant no longer felt untouchable. Perfect silence had cracked open for a moment, and through it, humanity had slipped inside. Clara stood carefully from beside the child and offered the mother a reassuring smile. "He is very brave," she whispered kindly. The exhausted woman looked close to tears herself. "Thank you," she mouthed silently. Clara nodded once before stepping away as though calming terrified children beneath chandeliers was simply another ordinary part of her shift. Ethan watched her the entire time. He barely noticed Vanessa speaking across the table anymore. "I cannot believe this place lost power," she complained quietly while checking her reflection in the black screen of her phone. "For what they charge here, you would think they could afford generators that actually work." Ethan said nothing. His attention remained fixed on Clara moving through the dim red lighting with trays balanced gracefully in her hands. She looked tired, overworked, yet somehow she was still the calmest person in the entire room. Vanessa finally set down her wine glass with a soft clink. "Okay," she said slowly. "What is happening?" Ethan looked at her. "What do you mean? You have barely listened to me all night." Her tone remained pleasant, but irritation crept beneath it now. "You keep staring at the waitress." Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. The candle between them flickered softly, throwing shadows across the tablecloth. "I think she seems kind," he answered honestly. Vanessa blinked once as if he had spoken another language entirely. Then she laughed under her breath. "Kind?" She glanced toward Clara dismissively. "Ethan, she works double shifts carrying plates for rich people. Of course she acts kind." Something cold settled inside Ethan then. Not toward Clara. Toward the realization that people like Vanessa truly believe kindness was performance. A transaction. A survival strategy. He thought again about Clara crying alone in the service hallway where nobody could see her. No audience. No reward. Just exhaustion and fear carried quietly behind polite smiles. The lights suddenly flickered fully back on, flooding the restaurant once more in warm gold. Guests applauded lightly. Crystals sparkled again. Wealth reassembled itself around the room, as if nothing vulnerable had happened at all. But Ethan noticed Clara pause briefly beneath the returning brightness. Just for half a second. Her eyes closed softly, as though she were forcing herself to stay standing. Then she continued working. A few minutes later, she approached Ethan's table carrying fresh drinks. Vanessa barely looked up from her phone. "About time," she muttered. Clara carefully placed the glasses down. Ethan noticed a faint tremble in her fingers now. Exhaustion was winning. "Thank you," he said quietly. Clara looked up, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Their eyes met properly for the first time that night. Up close, Ethan could see tiny silver flecks hidden inside her blue eyes like reflections of rainwater beneath moonlight. Clara offered a small tired smile. "You are welcome, sir." Then her phone buzzed sharply inside her apron pocket. Ethan saw panic flash across her face instantly. Real panic. Clara stepped back quickly and checked the message. Her entire expression changed. Color drained from her cheeks so fast it frightened him. "Is everything all right?" Ethan asked before he could stop himself. Clara swallowed hard and forced another smile that looked painfully fragile now. "Yes, sir," she whispered automatically. But her eyes betrayed her completely. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Then the restaurant manager called her name again from across the room, and Clara hurried away toward the kitchen while clutching her phone tightly against her chest like it carried the weight of her entire world. Ethan watched her disappear behind the swinging service doors while thunder rolled above the city once more. And suddenly dinner no longer mattered at all. There are moments in life when the heart recognizes something before the mind can explain it. Ethan felt that moment the second Clara disappeared behind the kitchen doors, clutching her phone like terrible news, had reached through the storm and wrapped itself around her throat. Vanessa continued speaking across the table, but her words faded into meaningless background noise beneath the steady rhythm of rain against glass. "Ethan," she said finally, clearly irritated now. "Are you even listening to me?" He looked at her slowly. Candlelight flickered across her flawless makeup and carefully practiced smile. For the first time all evening, he noticed how tired he felt sitting across from someone who never said anything real. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I think I need some air." Vanessa blinked in disbelief. "During dinner?" Ethan stood, reaching for his coat. "I will pay for everything." "That is not the point." Her voice sharpened slightly. Nearby diners glanced toward them. "Then what is the point?" Ethan asked gently. The question seemed to surprise even him. Vanessa stared at him for several silent seconds before leaning back in her chair with cold composure. "You know," she said quietly, "Daniel told me you were emotionally unavailable. I did not realize he meant completely unreachable." Ethan did not argue, because somewhere deep down, he knew she was right. He had spent years building walls so high that eventually even happiness stopped trying to climb over them. He left the private dining room without another word. The hallway outside the kitchen smelled of coffee, warm bread, and rain-damp coats hanging near the employee entrance. Staff hurried past carrying trays and folded linens while thunder rolled softly above the city. Ethan moved toward the service corridor where he had first seen Clara crying earlier that night. Voices echoed faintly from around the corner. "Please," Clara whispered urgently. Ethan stopped immediately. "I understand, but he is only 9 years old." Silence. Then Clara spoke again, her voice trembling now despite every effort to control it. "I know the surgery deadline is tomorrow morning. I am trying." Ethan felt his chest tighten painfully. Through the partially open doorway, he could see Clara standing alone beside the lockers once again. Her shoulders shook faintly beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. "Can I at least have until Monday?" she whispered into the phone. Another long silence followed before Clara closed her eyes tightly. "Okay," she said softly. "Thank you anyway." She lowered the phone slowly after the call ended, but this time she did not cry immediately. Somehow that was worse. She simply stood there staring at nothing while exhaustion settled over her like winter snow. Ethan should have walked away. Instead, he stepped forward before logic could stop him. Clara looked up quickly, startled. Embarrassment flashed across her face instantly. "I am sorry," she said automatically while wiping beneath her eyes. "You were not supposed to hear that." Ethan shook his head gently. "You do not have to apologize for being worried." Clara gave a faint, humorless laugh under her breath. "That is kind of you to say, but worry does not really pay hospital bills." The honesty of the sentence hung quietly between them. No self-pity, no manipulation, just truth. Ethan glanced toward the crumpled paper peeking from her apron pocket. "Your brother?" Clara hesitated before nodding slowly. "His name is Oliver." Her voice softened immediately at the mention of him. "He needs heart surgery." Ethan felt something crack open inside him then. Not dramatically, quietly, like ice breaking beneath dark water. "How old is he?" 9. Clara looked down at the floor. "He keeps asking if we can still decorate the apartment for Christmas." She smiled faintly despite the tears gathering again in her eyes. "I told him of course we can." Ethan could not remember the last time someone had broken his heart simply by trying to stay hopeful. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Beyond the service hallway, the restaurant continued glowing with wealth and polished elegance while rain washed against the glass skyline outside. But here beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by metal lockers and stacked linen carts, everything felt painfully real. Clara looked embarrassed now, as if allowing someone to glimpse her struggle had exposed something deeply private. She quickly wiped her cheeks again and forced herself to straighten. "I should get back to work," she said softly. "People are waiting." Ethan nodded slowly, though neither of them moved right away. "Does your brother know?" he asked quietly. Clara's expression softened immediately. "About the money?" Ethan nodded. She shook her head. "Oliver already worries too much." A faint smile touched her lips despite everything. "He keeps pretending he feels stronger than he really does because he thinks it makes my life easier." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. Something about the sentence struck him harder than it should have. He remembered being 10 years old himself standing beside a hospital bed while his younger sister Lily smiled weakly and told everyone she was fine even when she was not. He had not thought about Lily in years. Not properly. Grief had become another locked room inside him. But tonight, somehow, Clara's voice reached places even time had stopped touching. How long have you been doing this alone? Ethan asked. Clara gave a small tired laugh. Long enough to get good at pretending I am not scared. Ethan looked at her carefully then. She did not look weak to him. She looked exhausted from carrying too much without permission to collapse. Before he could respond, the kitchen doors burst open and the restaurant manager stepped into the hallway looking furious. Clara, what are you doing? His eyes flicked immediately toward Ethan, and his entire posture changed into nervous professionalism. Mr. Calloway, he said quickly, recognizing him now. I apologize if there has been any inconvenience. Clara's face went pale. I am sorry, Mr. Bennett, she said immediately. I just needed 1 minute. 1 minute? The manager snapped quietly. You disappeared during peak dinner service while guests are waiting? Ethan saw Clara instinctively lower her eyes again. It will not happen again. The manager sighed impatiently before glancing toward Ethan once more, clearly worried about upsetting an important customer. I assure you this is not our normal standard. Ethan felt something cold settle into his voice then. Actually, he said calmly, she has been the most professional person here tonight. The manager blinked in surprise. Clara looked up too. Ethan held the older man's gaze steadily. Your staff handled a difficult situation during the outage better than most executives I know would have. Silence filled the hallway. The manager forced an awkward smile immediately. Of course. Thank you, sir. Then he looked back toward Clara, suddenly less aggressive. Just get back out there. Clara nodded quickly. Yes, sir. The manager disappeared again through the kitchen doors. Clara released a quiet breath once he was gone. You did not have to do that, she whispered. Ethan looked at her gently. Maybe I wanted to. Their eyes met again beneath the flickering fluorescent lights, while thunder rolled softly beyond the city skyline. For one strange, suspended moment, neither wealth nor status seemed to exist between them anymore. Just two tired people standing quietly in the middle of a storm. Then Clara's phone buzzed again. She checked the screen quickly, and Ethan saw immediate relief flood her expression. It is Oliver, she said softly. He cannot sleep unless I call him before his medication. Without thinking, Ethan smiled faintly. You should answer. Clara hesitated. I am still working. Then tell your manager I said your break is approved. Clara laughed unexpectedly at that. A real laugh this time. Small, warm, honest. And hearing it did something dangerous to Ethan Calloway. It made him realize he did not want the sound to disappear. Clara stepped into the small employee break room with her phone pressed against her ear, while Ethan remained quietly in the hallway outside. Through the partially opened door, he could hear the softness in her voice change completely the moment her brother answered. Hey, Ollie, she whispered warmly. You should be asleep. A small boy's voice crackled faintly through the speaker. Ethan could not make out every word, only the sound of innocence fighting to stay cheerful. Clara smiled despite the exhaustion still lingering in her eyes. No, I am not working too hard, she lied gently. And yes, I remembered. Your dinosaur pajamas before I left. Ethan leaned lightly against the hallway wall beneath the dim light overhead and listened without meaning to. Strange how a simple conversation could feel more intimate than every polished dinner party he had attended in years. Did the nurse give you the blue medicine? Clara asked softly. Silence. Then she laughed quietly. Oliver Bennett, you promised me no hiding pills in the applesauce anymore. Ethan found himself smiling faintly without realizing it. Inside the break room, Clara sat down slowly at the small metal table near the vending machine while rainwater glimmered against the tiny window behind her. I know you are scared, she whispered after a moment. But I need you to be brave one more time for me, okay? Ethan lowered his eyes then, because suddenly he remembered another hospital room long ago. Another frightened child trying to smile for the people she loved. Lily had been 12 when cancer took her. Ethan had been 17 and powerless to stop it. After she died, success became the only thing he trusted because money was measurable, predictable, unlike love, unlike loss. But standing here outside a cramped employee break room, while a tired waitress comforted her little brother through a prepaid cell phone, Ethan realized something terrifying. He had spent half his life becoming rich and the other half becoming emotionally numb enough not to notice what it cost him. Clara ended the call a few minutes later and remained seated quietly for a moment afterward, staring down at the cracked phone screen in her hands. Ethan noticed she looked calmer now. Still tired. Still frightened. But anchored again somehow. She finally stepped back into the hallway and looked surprised to see him still there. "You stayed," she said softly. Ethan shrugged slightly. "I guess I did." Clara smiled faintly. "Most people would not." Ethan looked at her carefully. "Most people probably do not know what matters." The words escaped before he could stop them. Clara studied him curiously then, as if trying to understand how a man wearing a suit worth several $1,000s could suddenly sound so sincere standing beside industrial coffee machines and mop buckets. "You know," she said gently, "you seem different than I expected." Ethan almost laughed. "That makes two of us." Their eyes met again. This time the silence between them felt less awkward and more dangerous. Not dangerous in the loud, dramatic way movies portrayed love. Dangerous because it felt honest. Real. The kind of connection that quietly changes the direction of a person's life before they even realize it has begun. Then Clara glanced at the expensive watch on Ethan's wrist, and her expression shifted suddenly. "Your date," she said quickly. "You should probably get back before she thinks you disappeared." Ethan stared at her for a moment before answering truthfully. "I think she already knows." Clara laughed softly under her breath, but her smile faded when her phone buzzed again. She checked the message and went still. Ethan saw fear return instantly to her eyes. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Clara swallowed hard before speaking. "The hospital moved Oliver's surgery deposit deadline up to midnight tonight." Her voice cracked slightly despite every effort to stay composed. "If I cannot pay by then, they are giving the operating room slot to another patient." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs slowly. Outside the restaurant windows, lightning flashed white across the Manhattan skyline, while somewhere far below, millions of strangers continued living their ordinary lives completely unaware that one exhausted waitress was about to lose the only chance to save her little brother. For a second the world seemed to go completely silent around Ethan Calloway. The restaurant noise faded. The jazz music disappeared beneath the storm outside. Even the glow of chandeliers behind the hallway doors suddenly felt far away and meaningless. Midnight. Just a few hours stood between Clara's little brother and the surgery that might save his life. Clara lowered her phone slowly, trying to keep herself composed, but Ethan could see panic spreading beneath the surface now like cracks through glass. "I can pick up another shift tomorrow," she whispered mostly to herself. "Maybe I can call the billing office again." Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "Clara." She looked up immediately. "How much is the deposit?" Clara hesitated. Embarrassment flickered across her exhausted face again. "It does not matter." "How much?" Ethan repeated softly. Clara swallowed hard. $20,000. The number landed quietly between them. To Clara Bennett, it sounded impossible. To Ethan Calloway, it was less than the cost of the watch on his wrist. But somehow that realization did not make him feel powerful. It made him feel sick. Because somewhere in New York City, a little boy's future depended entirely on a number that wealthy people in restaurants spent carelessly on wine and jewelry every night. Clara looked away quickly. "I am sorry," she whispered. "You should not have to hear all this." Ethan watched her carefully. Even now she was apologizing for struggling. Apologizing for pain. Apologizing for existing too loudly inside a world that rewarded people like him for taking up space. Then Ethan made a decision that would quietly change both their lives forever. "What hospital?" Clara blinked in confusion. "What? Your brother's hospital. St. Matthew's Children's Center." Ethan nodded once and pulled his phone from his coat pocket. Clara immediately stepped back slightly. "No," she said softly but firmly. "Mr. Calloway, please." Ethan paused and looked at her. Clara shook her head slowly, tears gathering in her eyes now despite every attempt to remain composed. "I cannot accept that kind of money from someone I just met." Ethan lowered the phone carefully. "Why?" Clara gave a sad little laugh. "Because people like me do not survive by waiting for rich strangers to rescue us." Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes remained steady. "We survive by getting back up every time life knocks us down." Ethan felt the words hit him harder than any boardroom confrontation ever had. Because there was no bitterness in her voice. No manipulation. Only dignity. Real dignity. The kind money could never buy. He realized then that Clara Bennett was the strongest person he had met in years. Maybe ever. Ethan slipped his phone back into his pocket slowly. "Okay," he said gently. Clara looked surprised by how easily. He accepted her answer. Okay. Ethan nodded. Then let me ask you something else. He stepped slightly closer beneath the dim hallway light. If the roles were reversed, and I was the one losing someone I loved, would you help me? Clara opened her mouth, then stopped, because they both already knew the answer. Of course she would. Ethan smiled faintly then, the first real smile he had worn in longer than he could remember. That is the problem with people like you, Clara Bennett. She blinked softly. What? You think kindness makes you weak? Rain thundered harder against the windows outside, while warm golden light spilled from the restaurant behind them. Ethan reached into his coat pocket slowly and removed the velvet ring box he had carried all night. Clara stared at it in confusion. Ethan looked down at the expensive diamond ring inside for one quiet second before closing the box again. I came here tonight planning to propose to someone who looked perfect on paper, he said softly. Then he lifted his eyes back to Clara. But somehow I ended up meeting the first person in years who actually made me feel human again. Clara stood completely still beneath the flickering hallway light, while tears finally slipped silently down her cheeks. And somewhere deep inside the lonely spaces of Ethan Calloway's heart, something long frozen had finally begun to thaw.